Hi friends, welcome to another episode on my YouTube channel. I'm Hillary Mulick, a wedding photographer based in North Carolina, and today is a personal video. Since it's my last video of the year of 2022, I thought it would be fun to do a personal video. And if you've been following me on Instagram for a while, you know I'm a really big reader, and I thought it'd be fun to share my top 10 books that I read this last year. If you follow my Goodreads account, I have read over 60 books this last year. So I decided to put together my top 10. These aren't in any specific order. They're just randomly my top 10 favorites that I read this year, and I wanted to share them with you. Now, before we start, a little bit of a disclaimer. My favorite genres that I generally gravitate towards are romance and fantasy fiction. There are other books in this list that don't fall under those genres that I still really loved and that were my favorite books of the year, but a lot of these are going to be fantasy fiction and romance. So if you love those types of books as well, then maybe you can take some notes of some of these books that were my favorites. Book number 1 is called Firekeeper's Daughter, and this book is about a Native American woman. It's set in modern times, and she lives part of the time on a reservation with her family from her dad's side, and then part of the time in the United States going to college. And this story starts off where her best friend is shot and killed because of a drug exchange that is going on this Indian reservation. And so now, because of her personal investment in, her best friend being killed and her now being involved in this drug thing that is going on the reservation, 2 FBI agents approach her and ask for her help to basically go undercover and help them figure out how these drugs are being created and how they're being distributed. So it's a really good, really suspenseful story, and it was just so good. Definitely a page turner that I highly recommend. Next book is called Things You Save in a Fire, and this book is about a woman firefighter who is at the beginning of the book living in California, but she ends up having to transfer fire stations to a station in the Boston area to help take care of her mom who is sick. And she found that when she was living in California and working at the fire station there, things were a lot more progressive, and there were a lot of women firefighters at her station. Her fire chief was a female as well. And then when she gets transferred to this station in Boston, it's very much behind the times. They don't have any interaction with women. A lot of the men at the station don't really know what to do with her, and so she struggles trying to be one of the team. And I just really loved this story because I loved just learning about firefighters, and there was definitely lots of comedic relief in the book with all the fun things that firefighters do when they're together at the station in between going out and helping people. And then there's also a little bit of a love story weaved in there because she ends up starting to develop feelings for one of the firefighters at the station she's in the Boston area. And she really tries to reject these feelings because she's working so hard to be respected as a female firefighter, but I think you know where this story is going, and it was so good. I highly recommend it. This next book is called Book Lovers, and it's by Emily Henry, which I love Emily Henry's books. She's a really well-known romance writer, and this was her new book that came out this year. It starts off with a female writer who's having a hard time writing her next book. She's experiencing writer's block. So she goes to this really small lake town to just try and get away and write her next book. And she ends up running into an old colleague of hers who she really disliked. So since this is a romance book, it's an enemies to lovers situation. She runs into him in this small town, and she's like, oh my gosh, of all the people to run into, I run into this guy that I really hate. And he's writing a book as well. So the story goes where they end up being next door neighbors, and they are both writing books and helping each other write books. And then of course a romance develops during that, of course, and it was such a good read. The next book on my list is called Honor, and this is a little bit of a heavier read. I don't read a lot of heavy books because I tend to get very emotionally invested in them, but I really loved this book. It's about an Indian American woman who is living in Brooklyn. She's a reporter, and she's kind of forced to cover a story that is going on in India. And she's really reluctant to go back to India because she has a really dark past of something that happened in India as a child, which forced her whole family to then move to the United States, and that's where she finished up her upbringing and had currently been living. And so the story follows her. Her name's Smita. She goes back to India to cover this story of something that happened to this Hindu woman, and she ends up becoming really close to this Hindu woman, and then also facing some of the things that happened in her past. And it was just a really good story. I felt like it was a really important read after I was done reading it, and really touched my heart a lot, and it was so, so good. The next book is called The Happy Ever After Playlist, and I highly recommend reading this book through Audible or through an audiobook because the narrators were awesome. The chapters bounce back and forth between the male perspective and the female perspective of this romance that's going on. Of course, it's a romance. And they have a male narrator and a female narrator, and I just loved listening to it. It was like listening to a movie. And this story is about a woman whose fiance had passed away years previous, and she hadn't recovered from it, and she ends up finding this lost dog and trying to get a hold of the owner. And the owner ends up being a really well-known, really famous musician, and their relationship just starts over the bonding of this lost dog, and then of course they start a romance together as well, and it's just so, so sweet. I really enjoyed listening to this book. The next book on my list is called It Ends With Us. This is such a popular book, and actually the sequel came out this year, which is why I think this book continues to be popular. It's by Colleen Hoover, and it's about a young woman who has a history of physical violence through, not to herself personally, but through her parents. Her father was very physically abusive to her mother, and she ends up developing this relationship with this boy, and kind of goes to him for comfort when she sees this stuff happening in her home. And then something happens, and she ends up not continuing this relationship with this boy. Years later, she's living in the big city, and she ends up meeting and marrying this really attractive, really charismatic guy. And he ends up, after they've been married for some time, starting to show signs of physical abuse towards her. And because of her history and what she's seen happen to her parents, you kind of follow the story on how she navigates that. And then also the boy that she fell in love with as a child, who kind of, or not a child, but as a high schooler, as a young person, kind of, he's the one that helped her through the things that were going on with her parents. She ends up seeing him, running into him again in the city while she's in a relationship with this guy who's showing signs of physical abuse. So there ends up being just a little bit of a love triangle going on, and it's just a really good book. Definitely a page turner. I think I finished this book in like 2 or 3 days. It was really heavy, but I really loved the message and the story behind it, and I highly recommend it. This next book is a science fiction book. It's called Project Hail Mary. It came out this year, and I was really nervous to read this book initially. It was one of the book club books from one of the book clubs that I'm in, and I don't really have a science background, so I was just afraid that I wasn't going to understand a lot of what was going on in the book. But it was really, really good and explains everything really well. There's definitely a lot of science in it, but not anything to where it would deter you from reading this book if you don't have a science background like me. This book is about, it starts off with a man who wakes up from a coma on a spaceship alone, and he is experiencing amnesia. He doesn't remember anything about what brought him to being on this spaceship alone and waking up from a coma. And then throughout the book, he ends up having flashbacks, just remembrances through his amnesia of what was going on Earth years previous, and just the events that led him to being on the spaceship and what his mission actually is on the spaceship. It was such a good read. I've never read a book like this before, and I highly recommend it. Now, it's no secret that I love audiobooks. Audiobooks is one of the main reasons why I'm able to read so many books, because I spend a lot of time in the car driving to and from photo shoots, and so I end up listening to a lot of books. And one of my favorite narrators is Julia Wayland, and she has actually written a couple of books herself, and one of her books has made it onto my top 10 list this year. It's called Thank You for Listening, and it's a story about two audiobook narrators who start narrating a romance together, and then obviously things end up developing between them romantically. So it is a romance book, but I loved it because I listened to so many audiobooks. So this was a really fun book to listen to about the background of the life of an audiobook narrator, and just learning that process of what it's like to narrate an audiobook and that industry. And then also I loved the love story between the two narrators. And of course, I highly recommend this audiobook. It was narrated by Julia Wayland herself. So definitely recommend doing the audiobook with this one. So the last two books on my list are actually the first books of two series that I read this year. The first one is a series by Sarah J. Maas. She is very well known for her series called The Court of Thorns and Roses. And I actually read that series last year. And this series that I'm recommending here is called Throne of Glass. It was actually her first series that she wrote, and it is really, really good. It's a young adult series, fantasy fiction, and it follows a young woman assassin who is currently in prison, and she's taken out of prison to compete in this tournament for the king and whoever wins the tournament gets to be his own personal assassin, so the king's assassin. And she ends up learning throughout this process of being in the tournament just some things about her past and what put her in prison initially, and then also things are not as they seem, of course, and that there is more behind the tournament than what meets the eye. And the whole series is 8 books. I'm actually, as I'm recording this, reading the last book right now, the 8th book. I started this series over the summer, and it is just such a good series. If you love fantasy fiction, highly recommend it, Throne of Glass. The last series I want to recommend is called From Blood and Ash, and this series is about a young maiden who has been sheltered a lot of her life in the castle, and she's not allowed to talk to anybody, not allowed to see anybody, never allowed to leave the castle until something called the Ascension. And you don't really know what the Ascension is as the reader. Her as the maiden, which is the character that you're following, she doesn't really know what the Ascension is because nobody will tell her. So because she's been living such a sheltered life, she actually, on the down low, has learned how to fight and how to wield different weapons, and she's been sneaking out of the castle to experience things in the town. And she obviously is a very independent, very strong-willed woman despite her being so sheltered in this castle. And the story goes on, she ends up getting a new guard in the castle, and this guard is different than any of her other guards. She realizes that he's definitely not like other people she's met, and with him, she ends up being able to uncover the mystery of what the Ascension is and what's really going on in the castle and what her role in all of that is. It's so, so good. Definitely a page turner. This is a fantasy fiction. There are 4 books out currently. I think the full series is going to have 6 books eventually, but I went through those 4 books so, so quick. Highly recommend this series, Blood and Ash. And that's it. Those are my top 10 favorite books that I read this last year in the year 2022. If you want a full list of all the books that I've read this last year, because there are definitely a lot more books that I rated highly, you can go to my Goodreads account. I'll link that in the description down below. I also tend to post my favorite books on Instagram as well, so make sure you're following me there. And I'll see you again next week for another YouTube episode. Thank you so much for watching and have a happy new year. Bye.